Right, this is Brit Fonteneau, the Bozeman Director of Economic Development, and he's here to answer some questions. So, starting off, let's get into the integration of public and private sectors. More specifically, as the Director of Economic Development for the City of Bozeman, you oversee a whole lot of integration between public and private sector action. You yourself call it the private-public partnership, or maybe it's the other way around. But long story short, the PPP.
Yeah.
And in doing that, a lot of people might wonder why exactly the public sector needs to go to the private sector to get some things done. I was wondering if you could speak to your experience as to why that is true.
Okay. Thanks, Aiden. It's nice to be here. I appreciate the time to talk about this. So I think there is a very important nexus between public and private partnerships and the need and the value that PPP brings to communities, to states, and to countries. I think there are certain functions of a government that have historically and traditionally been important and continue to be important today. Those include infrastructure, and they also include public safety, public health, things like that. Now, government role evolves over time, obviously, and I think we've evolved further. And there are even more areas where I think government can take a leading role, but needs the support, needs the help, and oftentimes needs the expertise of the private sector in order to actually attain some of those goals.
Okay. Where a city might have chosen to do a similar thing, what would be their incentive to go through the private sector to achieve something that seemingly could have been done through the public sector?
Right. So the city of Bozeman, just to be clear, doesn't have a product per se. The product that Yellowstone Fiber offers is the infrastructure. And that what you're referring to, the model that you're referring to, is an open access model in broadband parlance. And so in that example, I think what's most important to sort of recognize is that at least in telecommunications world, those companies are required to pay dividends to their shareholders, and what's important to them is being in markets where they can do that, where they can get enough revenue to make it worth their while and their time to be in those markets. I mean, that's the way the free market system works. What government's role is in this example is to identify a gap or a problem that with some assistance from the private sector we could really work together to close that gap. And that's consistent with what I feel like economic development is all about, which is education, infrastructure, and supporting local businesses. And so in that example, we identified a need. We don't have the broadband service we have here is not up to any real standard. Even the FCC standards are pretty low when you look at other countries around the world. And so our goal, when we created the Bozeman Fiber Company, which is now Yellowstone Fiber, was to create a community benefit nonprofit that wasn't beholden to the shareholders, but was really interested in benefiting the community. Now, that's still a private company, and it will continue to be, but its goals are different. Its goals are to support the local community by providing that infrastructure layer so that service providers can deliver their product to the end user. So Bozeman Fiber, Yellowstone Fiber's customers are the service providers. They're the ones who have the content. The end user is the customer of the service provider. So Bozeman Fiber doesn't have that, or Yellowstone Fiber doesn't have that many customers. They have 5 or 6 providers on the network. Those providers then deliver the service to the end user. That is an example of how government identified a problem and created a solution that required private sector expertise and ultimately funding, because Bozeman Fiber partnered, before it became Yellowstone Fiber, partnered with Utopia to create a model that was successful at selling $65 million worth of private bonds in the open market to fund the expansion of the network that you referred to earlier. So when you mix that up together, you have a pretty powerful combination and powerful opportunities.
Yeah, and previously we had talked about the interests of public and private sectors and how they're different. And sometimes there's a natural overlap, but sometimes something needs to give. There needs to either be a change in public policy or private interests need to somehow change. Typically, public policy is the thing that gives rather than private interest. In your experience, what has been the most effective way at creating an overlap in shared interests?
Trying to come up with a model or a of talking about a gap that I referred to earlier, and demonstrating how filling that gap is in the best interest of the private entity, that business, that sector, that element of our that economy, of our local economy. Government has a certain role to play that I think is evolving over time, and has been since the creation of our country, as do our founding documents. I think all these things evolve over time. At least that's my perspective. And so if we believe that, then the government has to evolve as well. And identifying the gap, finding partners who you think have the expertise to help you fill that gap, and then being able to articulate clearly what the benefit is, not only to the company or companies or sector, but how it gives back to the community in a meaningful way.
Yellowstone Fiber being a non-affiliated, non-profit organization is indicative of a larger issue within the state of Montana. Statewide non-compete ordinances mean that the city of Bozeman can't directly compete with internet service providers. This means even when internet service is inadequate or unavailable entirely for citizens of Bozeman, the city can't step in and fulfill demand. This issue also extends to Bozeman's housing issue, with the Montana legislature recently banning an innovative Bozeman inclusionary zoning law that essentially forced the creation of affordable housing units. This statewide overreach of municipality policy is going to be an issue, and it needs to be addressed either from within the legislature, or the city of Bozeman needs to take the legislature to court. This is my biggest issue with Yellowstone Fiber, the fact that it could be so much more successful if political wills align to allow the city of Bozeman to carry out this vision directly.